Tonight, we will tell you the story of the year 1348, a year that became synonymous with the greatest catastrophe in medieval Europe, the Black Death. You will learn how a tiny, unseen enemy traveled across continents, how bustling trade routes became pathways for destruction, and how a seemingly isolated siege in a distant land ignited a pandemic that reshaped an entire continent. You will discover why this particular year became a turning point, marking the end of one era and the chilling beginning of another. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. New sleep stories are released here every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let your body sink into the quiet comfort around you. Our story begins not with the plague itself, but with the Europe that existed just before it, a continent on the cusp of significant change, yet unknowingly poised for an unprecedented challenge. By the early 14th century, Europe was a vibrant tapestry of kingdoms and cultures. After centuries of growth and relative peace, its population had swelled, reaching levels not seen before. Cities like London, Paris, Venice, and Genoa were burgeoning hubs of commerce and innovation. Merchants traveled vast distances, connecting Europe to the distant lands of Asia through intricate networks of trade routes. Goods, ideas, and people flowed freely, fostering prosperity and cultural exchange. Yet, beneath this veneer of progress, certain vulnerabilities were quietly taking root. The very density of these growing urban centers, with their narrow, crowded streets, rudimentary sanitation, and close proximity of people and animals, created conditions ripe for the rapid spread of disease. It was a world interconnected by ambition and trade, unknowingly creating the perfect pathways for an invisible threat that was, at that very moment, stirring far to the east. The early 14th century in Europe was a time of dynamic, if sometimes turbulent, change. You might imagine a world vastly different from our own, a tapestry woven with countless small villages, sprawling feudal estates, and an increasing number of bustling towns and cities. For nearly 2 centuries prior, a period of warming climate had brought with it agricultural improvements and a general increase in food production. This simple, profound fact, more than any king's decree or grand battle, allowed the population to grow steadily. More food meant more people, and these people in turn sought new opportunities, often migrating from the countryside to urban centers. As the population expanded, so too did the desire for goods and services, leading to a significant increase in trade. Imagine vast networks of overland routes where caravans laden with exotic spices from the east, luxurious silks, precious jewels, and fine textiles slowly made their way across the vast expanses of Asia and into Europe. Picture the Mediterranean Sea, a truly vibrant highway for maritime commerce with ships known as cogs and galleys constantly ferrying a diverse array of goods between the prosperous ports of Italy, the ancient lands of the Levant, the rich territories of North Africa, and the burgeoning markets of Northern Europe. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, these powerful Italian city-states became the economic arteries of the continent, their enterprising merchants establishing trading posts and colonies across the known world, from the distant shores of the Black Sea to the rugged Atlantic coast. These extensive routes, so essential for fostering prosperity and cultural exchange, were also unknowingly creating a perfect pathway for something far more sinister, an invisible passenger that would soon embark on its devastating journey. With more people and more trade, towns and cities began to swell, growing beyond their traditional boundaries. Medieval urban centers, unlike the sprawling metropolises of today, were inherently compact and densely packed. Stone walls, often built centuries earlier for defense against invaders, confined populations within narrow, unyielding boundaries, forcing buildings to rise higher and streets to shrink into labyrinthine alleys. Imagine walking through such a city on a warm summer day, the air thick with the heavy mingled smells of human and animal waste, unwashed bodies, the acrid smoke from countless hearths and blacksmiths' forges, and the pungent aroma of tanneries and butchers' shops, where raw hides and fresh meat hung exposed. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, almost non-existent by modern standards. Waste, both human and animal, was often simply thrown into the streets or open gutters, where it mingled freely with refuse from markets, decaying food scraps, and general runoff. Wells, the primary source of drinking water for most residents, were frequently contaminated by overflowing cesspits and the pervasive filth of the surrounding environment, a constant, unseen threat to health. People lived in incredibly close quarters, sometimes in multi-generational households. Families, often large, occupied single rooms or small multi-story houses crammed together, sharing limited space. Animals, chickens pecking in courtyards, pigs rooting in alleys, sometimes even cows kept on lower floors, were often housed within or immediately adjacent to homes, further contributing to the pervasive lack of hygiene. Fleas, lice, and rats were ubiquitous, unseen companions in every dwelling, every market stall, every ship, and every warehouse. They were simply an accepted, if unpleasant, part of life, their constant presence barely noticed amidst the daily struggle for survival and the constant hum of human activity. This extreme close proximity, combined with the almost complete lack of understanding about disease transmission, the very concept of microscopic pathogens was centuries away, meant that any infectious illness once introduced could spread with terrifying and unstoppable speed. A simple cough, a casual sneeze, a fleeting touch, these seemingly innocent actions could become potent vectors for widespread contagion, passing invisible killers from one person to another in a relentless chain. The communal nature of medieval life, while fostering strong social bonds and a sense of shared experience, also inadvertently facilitated the rapid spread of disease. People gathered frequently in churches for worship, in bustling markets for trade, in noisy taverns for socializing, and in guild halls for work and communal meals. Pilgrimages, a common and deeply ingrained practice of devout faith, saw thousands of individuals traveling vast distances, often on foot, stopping at crowded inns and shrines along their arduous routes, unknowingly carrying and exchanging not only stories and ideas, but also microscopic organisms. Soldiers on campaign, merchants on their extensive trade routes, and pilgrims on their spiritual journeys all acted as unwitting agents, connecting distant populations and ensuring that any new malady would not remain localized for long. There was no concept of quarantine or isolation, no understanding of how to contain an outbreak. Illness was often attributed to divine wrath, bad air, or an imbalance of humors within the body, leading to ineffective or even harmful treatments. The very infrastructure that supported Europe's growth and interconnectedness, its bustling ports, its well-trodden trade routes, its vibrant, densely populated cities, had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for a devastating pandemic. It was a world ripe for change, a civilization on the cusp of an unimaginable ordeal, blind to the invisible enemy slowly making its way across the vast distances, carried not by conquering armies or grand voyages of discovery, but by the smallest, most unassuming creatures, lurking in the shadows of human progress and prosperity. This interconnectedness, which brought wealth, knowledge, and cultural exchange, would soon bring something else entirely. Something that would redefine the very fabric of existence for generations to come. The stage was set, though no one in Europe could have known, for the arrival of a force that would reshape the continent in ways more profound than any war, famine, or political upheaval had ever done before. This interconnected yet unhygienic world unknowingly set the stage for a devastating pandemic. Yet the true beginning of this coming darkness lay far to the east, in the vast untamed landscapes of Central Asia. Here, amidst the arid steppes, rolling grasslands, and towering mountains, resided a silent, ancient enemy, the bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. This microscopic organism, the true architect of the plague, had long existed in natural reservoirs, primarily among specific species of wild rodent populations like marmots, gerbils, and other small mammals that thrived in the remote wilderness of what is now Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. It was a disease of the wild, an endemic threat, spread by fleas that fed on the blood of infected animals. When a host animal died, often within days, these fleas, now carrying millions of the deadly bacteria, would seek new sources of sustenance. They would often jump to other animals and occasionally to humans who ventured into their habitats, perhaps hunting or simply passing through. For centuries, this intricate biological cycle remained largely confined to these remote regions, occasionally causing localized outbreaks among nomadic communities or isolated villages, but rarely spilling over into the wider, more populated world. Protected by vast distances and limited human interaction with these specific wild rodent populations. However, the 14th century was an era of unprecedented global connection, driven primarily by the immense expansion of the Mongol Empire. Their vast dominion stretched across continents, from the steppes of Eastern Europe to the distant shores of the Pacific Ocean, creating the largest contiguous land empire in history. This colossal empire, forged by conquest and maintained by a network of military outposts and administrative centers, inadvertently created an intricate and efficient web of trade routes, most famously the legendary Silk Road. This ancient network of pathways, more a collection of interconnected trails and passages than a single unified road, had for centuries facilitated the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas between the vibrant civilizations of East and West. But in this new era, under the unified, albeit often brutal, peace of the Mongols, traffic along these routes intensified dramatically. Caravans, immense processions of camels and horses, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, laden with exotic silks, precious spices, aromatic incense, and valuable furs, traversed thousands of miles across unforgiving deserts and formidable mountains. These caravans carried not only their valuable cargo, but also an unseen menace. Fleas, tiny, resilient parasites, nestled deep within the abundant furs and textiles that formed part of the trade, or clinging to the black rats, Rattus rattus, that scurried alongside the merchants and their provisions, found perfect conditions for travel. These rats, natural companions to human settlements and trade, became unwitting, silent carriers of the plague. One slow, deliberate step after another, the infected fleas and their rodent hosts moved westward. Each caravan stop, each bustling caravanserai, a roadside inn providing shelter and supplies for travelers and their animals, became a new point of contact. Here, the disease could jump from wild rodents disturbed by human activity to the more common urban rats that frequented these human-made way stations, drawn by food scraps and shelter. And from these urban rats, with terrifying ease and speed, the infection could then spread to humans, who were often living in close proximity to both the animals and each other in these crowded, temporary settlements. The plague's relentless, silent journey brought it closer and closer to the European sphere of influence. It first reached the extensive territories of the Golden Horde, a powerful Mongol Khanate established by Batu Khan, a grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan. This formidable empire dominated the vast plains and fertile lands of Eastern Europe, controlling vital trade arteries that linked the heart of Asia to the Black Sea and the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. By the early 1340s, unsettling reports from this region began to speak of a mysterious, swift-killing illness. It swept through towns and nomadic encampments with horrifying speed, decimating populations within days of its appearance. The local inhabitants, both Mongols and their subjugated peoples, were utterly unfamiliar with such a virulent and merciless disease. Their traditional medicines and shamanistic practices proved utterly ineffective against its rapid progression. The Golden Horde's vast military campaigns, which often involved large movements of troops and their accompanying supply trains, combined with their extensive and well-maintained trade networks, once symbols of their immense power and prosperity, now served as perfect conduits for the plague. These activities accelerated its westward march, pushing it ever closer to Europe's doorstep. The invisible enemy moved through the rugged passes of the Caucasus Mountains, crept along the swampy shores of the Caspian Sea, and finally reached the strategic Crimean Peninsula. This region was a vital crossroads for trade, a bustling hub where Asian goods met European ships. Here, the stage was set for the plague's direct confrontation with European merchants, particularly those from the Italian city-states of Genoa and Venice. These astute traders, unaware of the impending catastrophe that journeyed alongside their lucrative cargo, continued their bustling commerce, eager to transport goods back to their prosperous homelands, thereby completing the final fatal link in the chain of transmission. The connection between the wild reservoirs of Central Asia, the expansive trade routes of the Mongol Empire, and the vulnerable, interconnected port cities of Europe was about to become tragically, devastatingly evident. The world held its breath unknowingly as the shadow of death crept ever closer. As the plague journeyed westward, carried by trade in the Mongol Empire, it converged upon a pivotal point in the Crimean Peninsula. This was the year 1346, and the place was Kaffa, a vital port city on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Kaffa was a cornerstone of medieval commerce, a jewel of the Genoese, a formidable maritime republic from Italy. Its docks teemed with ships from Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople, laden with spices, silks, and furs, a crucial conduit between eastern markets and European cities. Its strategic location, commanding access to the Black Sea and the Eurasian steppes, made it a prize of immense value, a true magnet for ambition. It was this prosperity that drew the attention of the Golden Horde, a powerful Mongol Khanate that had carved out a sprawling empire across much of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Under their resolute leader, Janabeg, a Khan known for his determination and military prowess, the Mongol army laid siege to Kaffa. The siege was protracted and arduous, a grim test of endurance. The Genoese defenders, resourceful and well entrenched within the city's formidable stone walls, resisted with tenacity, their crossbows and trebuchets answering assaults. Days turned into weeks, months, the air thick with dust and cries of conflict. Yet an unseen, more terrifying adversary began to stalk the Mongol camps. The plague that had traveled with them from Central Asia now unleashed its full might. It was the bubonic plague, a disease that struck with brutal speed. Warriors, hardened by countless campaigns, now succumbed to an invisible foe. They developed agonizingly swollen lymph nodes known as buboes in their armpits, groins, and necks, accompanied by fevers, chills, and delirium. The dark blotches caused by internal bleeding gave the disease its chilling moniker, the Black Death. Panic, swifter than any disease, rippled through the Mongol ranks. Their numbers dwindled rapidly, not from Genoese arrows, but from an internal enemy that defied understanding. The stench of death hung heavy, and Janabeg's once invincible army began to crumble. Faced with his army's collapse and the overwhelming devastation of this epidemic, Khan Janabeg made a decision of chilling audacity and cruelty. He chose to weaponize the very plague that was destroying his army. Historical accounts, notably from Gabriele de Mussi, a notary from Piacenza, describe this horrific act. Using their immense siege engines, catapults designed to hurl stones and projectiles, the Mongols hurled the corpses of their plague-infected soldiers over Kaffa's walls. These bodies, swollen and discolored by the disease, some still decomposing, arced through the air and crashed down within the besieged city. The sickening thud of their impact, followed by the sight of the dark, festering remains, unleashed not just physical contagion, but profound psychological terror among the Genoese defenders. The air within Kaffa became heavy with the putrid smell of death, a grim herald of the invisible enemy now so deliberately introduced. This crude act of biological warfare proved devastatingly effective. The plague, seeded into the confined, unsanitary conditions within Kaffa's walls, began its horrifying work with ruthless efficiency. The citizens, weakened by the siege, had no defense against this new, insidious threat. They breathed air tainted by decaying bodies, came into contact with contaminated materials, and soon infected fleas, abandoning dying rat hosts, found new prey among the human population. The death toll within Kaffa escalated rapidly, transforming the once thriving port into a charnel house. Streets that buzzed with trade now echoed with moans of the dying and cries of the grieving. The Genoese, caught between military assault and epidemic raging within, faced an untenable situation. Their forces were decimated, morale shattered, their city becoming a vast communal tomb. With no other recourse, they made the agonizing decision to abandon Kaffa. In late autumn 1347, Genoese merchant ships, not laden with silks and spices, but with desperate survivors, slipped away from the plague-stricken city. These vessels were not merely transporting refugees, they were, unknowingly, carrying the seeds of the plague to a new continent. Each ship became a floating incubator, harboring infected rats in its holds, carrying disease-laden fleas, and, crucially, transporting humans already incubating deadly contagion. As these ships set sail westward across the Black Sea, their destination was Europe, specifically the major Italian port cities, heart of their trading empire. Unbeknownst to those on board, or unsuspecting populations, they were not escaping the plague, but actively serving. The horror unleashed in Caffa was not contained within its walls. It set sail with the surviving Genoese merchants, escaping the besieged port. These ships, once symbols of prosperity, now became floating coffins, laden with precious cargo and, unbeknownst to their crews, a far deadlier payload. The journey across the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, and into the Mediterranean was a voyage of deepening despair and mounting fatalities. Day by day, more sailors began to sicken, their bodies racked by violent fevers, bone-chilling cold, and the horrifying emergence of the telltale swellings, the buboes, in their armpits, groins, and necks. Many succumbed swiftly, their feverish cries replaced by the silence of death, their lifeless forms tossed unceremoniously into the cold, dark waters, leaving behind an eerie emptiness on deck. Others lay dying, their moans echoing across the waves, a chilling prelude to the suffering that awaited Europe. Rats, too, infested the holds, scurrying amidst the cargo, carrying the fleas that harbored the insidious bacteria Yersinia pestis, the true invisible enemy, now crossing continents. It was in early October of 1347 that the first of these grim vessels, a galley from Caffa, limped into the bustling harbor of Messina on the northern coast of Sicily. The sight that greeted the port authorities and curious onlookers was utterly appalling. Dead men lashed to the helms, sick men barely clinging to life, their skin mottled and dark, and a pervasive, sickening stench, unlike anything known, that seemed to emanate from the very timbers of the ship. The townspeople, accustomed to the varied sights and sounds of a busy port, were nevertheless shocked by the spectral appearance of the crew. They quickly realized this was no ordinary illness, no common fever. The sick, when cautiously brought ashore, deteriorated with terrifying rapidity, their bodies quickly covered in dark, bruised spots, a symptom that would soon give the malady its terrifying moniker, the Black Death. Messina became the plague's first devastating European foothold. Within mere days, the disease raged uncontrollably through the city. The initial victims were, predictably, those who had come into direct contact with the ships or their wretched crews, dock workers, merchants, curious onlookers. But the contagion, carried by the fleas that abandoned their dying rat hosts for human warmth, then quickly spread from person to person through unhygienic conditions and close proximity, often through infected bodily fluids, though the true mechanism of transmission remained a terrifying mystery to the bewildered populace. Panic, cold and raw, seized the entire population. Families, once bound by unbreakable ties, abandoned their dying loved ones. Distraught priests refused to administer last rites for fear of contagion, and the once vibrant, noisy streets of Messina grew eerily quiet, save for the heart-wrenching cries of the afflicted and the mournful, incessant tolling of church bells, marking the endless procession of the dead. The overwhelmed authorities, desperate and helpless, attempted the futile measure of expelling the plague-ridden ships, ordering them out of the harbor. But it was already far too late. The invisible killer was already deeply entrenched, burrowing its way into the very fabric of the city, claiming lives with chilling efficiency. Expelled from Messina, or simply seeking other less vigilant havens, other infected vessels from the Kaffa fleet continued their journey, spreading the plague like a deadly, unstoppable ink blot across the Mediterranean. Some headed north, making fateful landfall in Genoa, the wealthy home port of many of these ill-fated ships. Despite grim reports already filtering in from Messina, and perhaps out of a desperate hope their own city would be spared, the Genoese authorities were tragically slow to grasp the full, horrifying scope of the threat. When the ships arrived, carrying their dying and dead, the plague quickly established itself with brutal efficiency. The narrow, winding streets, the bustling port, the cramped, unsanitary living quarters, and the constant, dense flow of people created ideal conditions for the disease to flourish unchecked. The city, a colossal hub of maritime trade, soon became a new, terrifying epicenter of death, its proud populace decimated daily. From Genoa, the plague moved with astonishing swiftness to Venice, another magnificent jewel of the Italian mercantile world. Venice, with its intricate network of canals, densely packed islands, and a population living in close quarters, was particularly vulnerable. Though its public health measures were, for the era, among the most advanced, including pioneering attempts at mandatory quarantine for incoming ships, the sheer, overwhelming speed and unprecedented virulence of the Black Death utterly overwhelmed all precautions. Bodies piled up in the squares, gondolas once filled with laughing merchants now carried only the dead, shrouded and silent, to mass graves, and the city's famed beauty was irrevocably marred by the grim, omnipresent reality of widespread suffering and decay. The Doge, the chief magistrate of Venice, and his council, along with the city's leading physicians and scholars, could only watch in horror as their beloved city succumbed to the invisible scourge. Simultaneously, other ships from the infected fleet made their way to Pisa, a significant and prosperous port in Tuscany, and then, with terrifying speed, the disease spread quickly inland to Florence, a burgeoning center of commerce, art, and culture. The pattern was relentlessly consistent and devastatingly effective. Arrival at a major port, rapid and exponential internal spread, and then relentless dissemination along all major inland trade routes, carried by terrified merchants, desperate pilgrims, and countless refugees fleeing the initial horrifying outbreaks. The unusually warm and damp conditions of the autumn and early winter of 1347 to 1348, following a period of prolonged heavy rains, were, tragically, unusually favorable for the rapid proliferation of rats and their flea parasites, inadvertently aiding the plague's terrifying, relentless progress across the land. The European continent, densely populated after centuries of sustained growth and intricately interconnected by a vibrant, bustling web of trade and travel, unknowingly stood on the very brink of an unprecedented, unimaginable catastrophe, a year of unparalleled suffering that would forever reshape its destiny. The stage was now set for 1348 to become the year of the Black Death, a period etched into the annals of history as a time when humanity faced an invisible, relentless foe that defied all understanding and brought an entire civilization to its knees, leaving behind a legacy of profound change and a chilling reminder of vulnerability. The arrival in Messina, Sicily, in October of the year 1347 marked the true beginning of Europe's encounter with the pestilence. From that crucial port, the plague did not merely spread, it erupted, consuming the island with a ferocity that defied comprehension. Within weeks, the bustling docks of Messina, once vibrant with the clamor of trade and the scent of exotic spices, became scenes of utter despair. Ships, carrying not just goods but the invisible seeds of contagion, departed Messina, inadvertently becoming vectors of death to other major Italian cities. Genoa, a powerful maritime republic with extensive trading networks stretching across the Mediterranean, was among the next to fall. When the infected ships from Messina docked in Genoa's crowded harbor, pestilence disembarked with the sailors and merchants, finding fertile ground in the city's narrow streets and densely packed homes, ideal for rapid transmission. The same horrifying story unfolded in Venice, another colossal trading power whose intricate canals, once pathways of commerce, now silently bore witness to death. Its close-knit communities and bustling marketplaces allowed the plague to surge through its population with terrifying speed. These port cities, once symbols of wealth, innovation, and global connectivity, transformed into epicenters of suffering, their prosperity now accelerating their demise. From these devastated coastal strongholds, the Black Death moved relentlessly inland, following the well-worn arteries of trade and human movement that crisscrossed the Italian peninsula. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, a vibrant center of art, commerce, and intellectual life, found itself utterly unprepared for the scale of the catastrophe when the plague struck with full force in the spring of 1348. The city, accustomed to a robust population and bustling markets, was suddenly enveloped in a terrifying silence, broken only by death knells. The plague manifested itself with horrifying clarity. Large, painful swellings known as buboes appeared in the groin, armpits, or a neck, often turning black. They were accompanied by raging fever, chills, and excruciating pain that racked the body. Death often followed with chilling swiftness, sometimes within days, sometimes even hours, leaving little time for comprehension. The sheer speed and overwhelming lethality of the disease shattered every existing social and medical system. Doctors, relying on ancient theories of humors such as bloodletting or herbal poultices, were utterly powerless against this unseen enemy. Many physicians themselves quickly succumbed to the contagion, leaving the sick without even the pretense of medical care. Hospitals, already rudimentary and ill-equipped, were quickly overflowing with the dying, their courtyards piled high with unburied bodies, creating a stench of decay. Public services collapsed, civic order frayed, fear, raw and pervasive, gripped the population. People abandoned their homes, their families, even their dying loved ones in desperate, often futile, attempts to escape the contagion. Parents deserted their children, spouses fled from each other, driven by self-preservation. The very fabric of society began to unravel as traditional bonds of kinship and community dissolved under the immense pressure of survival. The dead, once honored with solemn rites and proper burials, were now often left unceremoniously in mass graves or simply in the streets for fear of instant death. The familiar rhythm of daily life ceased entirely, a chilling stillness. Markets stood empty, workshops silent, and the once vibrant public spaces, the piazzas of Italian cities, became hushed, haunted landscapes, echoing with the cries of the sick or the mournful tolling of bells, a sound synonymous with omnipresent death. The economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic, rippling through life. Trade, the very lifeblood of these wealthy republics, ground to a halt as ships lay idle and merchants feared to venture forth. Labor shortages became acute as vast numbers of workers, from field hands to artisans, perished, leading to abandoned fields, unharvested crops, and a collapse in manufacturing. The value of goods plummeted, while the cost of what little labor remained skyrocketed. Estates lay fallow, businesses failed, and the once thriving urban centers, the engines of commerce, faced utter ruin. Beyond the physical devastation and economic paralysis, the plague inflicted a profound psychological toll on the survivors. Despair was widespread and deeply ingrained, fueled by the inexplicable nature of the disease and the apparent helplessness of human and divine intervention. Many believed it was a direct divine punishment, a terrifying sign of God's wrath, leading to a desperate search for spiritual solace through prayer and penance. Conversely, others reacted with a complete abandonment of moral restraints, embracing hedonism and debauchery, believing that since death was imminent, one should enjoy life to the fullest. Still others retreated into devout asceticism, seeking purification through self-flagellation and piety. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable. Chroniclers of the time struggled to find words to convey the horror and the loss. In Florence, it's estimated that between 50% and 75% of the population perished within a few short months. Similar horrifying statistics emerged from Venice, Genoa, Siena, and other major Italian centers, transforming communities into ghost towns. The once bustling streets became eerily quiet, punctuated only by the cries of the sick or the mournful tolling of bells, a sound synonymous with omnipresent death. Italy, the first gateway for the Black Death into Europe, became its first and perhaps most devastating proving ground, demonstrating the plague's terrifying capacity to utterly reshape a continent. The grim lessons learned here about the plague's speed and societal impact would soon be echoed across the rest of Europe as the pestilence continued its inexorable march. The relentless tide of death, having overwhelmed the Italian peninsula, did not halt at its very borders. From the ravaged port cities of Genoa and Pisa, merchant ships, many carrying desperate infected refugees, set sail for other shores, unwittingly carrying the very pestilence they sought to escape. The next major landfall for the Black Death was the bustling port of Marseille, in southern France. It was late in the year 1347, or perhaps very early 1348, when the first infected vessels docked there. The city, a vibrant hub of trade connecting the Mediterranean to the European interior, was ill-prepared for the silent, invisible enemy that disembarked alongside the cargo. Almost immediately, the telltale signs began to appear. Swollen, blackened buboes, the painful lymph node swellings that gave the bubonic plague its name, emerged in the armpits, groins, and necks of the afflicted. Fever, delirium, and then swift death followed. The local authorities, initially bewildered, soon found themselves powerless. The narrow, crowded streets of Marseille, designed for bustling commerce, became conduits for the disease. The dense population, living in close quarters with poor sanitation, offered no resistance. The plague spread with terrifying speed, engulfing the city in a matter of weeks. The air itself seemed to grow heavy with the stench of sickness and decay, a grim testament to the overwhelming number of dead. People barricaded themselves in their homes, but the plague found its way through cracks and under doors, carried by fleas on rats or by the breath of those already infected with the pneumonic form of the disease. The usual rhythms of life ceased. Markets stood empty. Shops were shuttered, and the bells of the churches tolled incessantly, marking the unending procession of new victims. From Marseille, the plague began its inexorable march inland, following the well-worn paths of trade routes and rivers. It moved up the Rhone River Valley, reaching Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, by March 1348. Avignon, a city of immense religious and political importance, was particularly vulnerable due to its dense population and constant influx of visitors from across Europe. The papal court itself was deeply affected. Chroniclers noted that cardinals and their entourages perished in great numbers. Pope Clement VI, though terrified, remained in the city, reportedly isolating himself and sitting between two large fires, a common but ineffective belief that intense heat could ward off the contagion. The death toll in Avignon was staggering, transforming the vibrant city into a charnel house. The relentless spread continued, radiating outwards from these early epicenters. From Avignon, the plague advanced further into the heart of France, devastating towns and villages along its path. Bordeaux, a vital port on the Atlantic coast, was soon infected, likely by ships arriving from infected areas or by overland routes from the south. The disease did not discriminate. Rich and poor, clergy and commoner, all fell before it. Fields lay fallow, crops rotted, and livestock wandered unattended as the human population dwindled. The very fabric of rural life, dependent on continuous labor, began to unravel. Simultaneously, the plague made its way across the Pyrenees, the formidable mountain range forming a natural border between France and the Iberian Peninsula. It likely entered Spain through two main routes: overland through the passes, carried by travelers or refugees from southern France, and by sea, arriving in the bustling port cities along the Mediterranean coast, such as Valencia and Barcelona. Barcelona, a major maritime power and a thriving commercial center, was hit particularly hard in the spring of 1348. The city's extensive trade networks, which had once been its strength, now became its undoing, acting as superhighways for the disease. Whole families vanished, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned possessions. The municipal authorities struggled to cope, their efforts overwhelmed by the sheer scale of death. Burial grounds quickly filled, and mass graves became a grim necessity. From these coastal footholds, the Black Death surged inland across the Iberian Peninsula, reaching the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal. Seville, one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Castile, experienced a catastrophic loss of life. Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, also suffered immensely. The chroniclers of the time, often priests or monks, recorded the horror with stark, simple words, describing deserted villages, silent cities, and the pervasive smell of death that hung in the air. The familiar rhythms of prayers in daily life were replaced by a desperate, unending struggle for survival, or simply for a quick end. The plague's passage through France and Spain was not merely a geographical expansion. It was a deepening of the catastrophe, a grim rehearsal for the devastation that would soon engulf the rest of Europe. The sheer speed and totality of the affliction defied all understanding, leaving behind a landscape of grief and an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. As the plague continued its devastating sweep across the Iberian Peninsula, its relentless march did not halt at the coastline. Instead, carried by the very arteries of medieval commerce, it extended its shadowy reach across the English Channel. The island nation of England, deeply connected to continental Europe through a vibrant network of trade, was an inevitable next destination. It was in the summer of the year 1348 that the pestilence made its fateful landing on English soil. A ship, or perhaps several, arriving from the infected ports of Gascony in southwestern France, docked in the small bustling port of Melcombe Regis, in Dorset, on the southern coast of England. These vessels, laden with goods and unknowingly with death, carried diseased sailors and merchants who disembarked, bringing the invisible enemy ashore. From Melcombe Regis, the plague did not delay. It followed the well-trodden paths of human movement, spreading first to the surrounding villages and towns, then steadily northwards. The close-knit communities, with their narrow streets and often unsanitary conditions, offered fertile ground for the contagion to take root and flourish. By autumn, the Black Death had reached the great city of London, the vibrant heart of England. London, with its dense population, crowded tenements, and bustling markets, became a crucible of the disease. The River Thames, usually a bustling artery of life, transformed into a conveyor of death as bodies were ferried away for burial, and the disease spread rapidly through the city's labyrinthine alleys. The sheer speed and scale of the mortality were unprecedented, overwhelming the capacity for burial and leaving countless homes desolate. The bells that once tolled for individual deaths now rang almost continuously, a mournful chorus across the land. The English countryside, too, suffered immensely as the plague moved from village to village, decimating populations and leaving fields untended. It showed no regard for social standing. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, all fell before its invisible might. Meanwhile, across the North Sea and further east, the plague continued its advance into the Low Countries, a region comprising modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, known for its rich mercantile cities and dense populations. From the northern coasts of France, and by ships sailing from infected English ports, the disease found its way into Flanders and Brabant. Cities like Bruges and Ghent, vital centers of textile production and trade, became new epicenters of suffering. The economic activity that had once brought prosperity now inadvertently facilitated the plague's rapid dissemination. The bustling wharves, the crowded marketplaces, the close quarters of artisanal workshops, all contributed to the swift spread of the contagion. From the Low Countries, and also directly from the Rhineland regions, the Black Death penetrated deeply into the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire, a vast and complex political entity encompassing much of Central Europe, including present-day Germany. Along the great rivers, the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube, which served as vital trade arteries, the plague flowed like a dark current. Merchant barges and riverboats, once symbols of prosperity, now became vectors of affliction, carrying the disease from one riverine town to another. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Hamburg, bustling hubs of commerce, experienced the same horrifying mortality rates as their Western counterparts. The structured life of medieval German towns, with their guilds and elaborate social hierarchies, crumbled under the weight of illness and death. Attempts to quarantine or restrict movement were largely futile against an enemy so insidious and pervasive. Further north, across the cold, gray waters of the Baltic Sea, the Black Death reached the distant lands of Scandinavia. From German Hanseatic League ports, merchant ships carried the infection to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The arrival in Norway, for instance, is often attributed to an English ship that docked in Bergen, a major trading port, in the late summer of 1349. The crew, already dying or dead, brought the plague ashore. From these coastal entry points, the disease slowly but relentlessly moved inland, affecting isolated communities and vast, sparsely populated areas. Even in these less densely populated regions, the impact was profound. Villages were wiped out, farms abandoned, and the social fabric, though perhaps less complex than in the South, suffered a severe rupture. The cold climate offered no barrier to its advance. By the end of 1349 and into 1350, the initial, most devastating wave of the Black Death had swept across virtually all of Western Europe, from the sun-drenched plains of Castile to the icy fjords of Norway, from the bustling markets of Italy to the remote hamlets of England. It was a relentless, unstoppable force, a truly continental catastrophe. The speed of its propagation was astonishing, considering the limitations of medieval travel, a testament to the interconnectedness of the European world, even in the 14th century. The scale of death was unimaginable, perhaps 30 to 50% of the total population, leading to a profound and universal sense of despair. Entire families vanished, communities were decimated, and the very concept of continuity seemed to shatter. The sheer volume of death left survivors in a state of shock, grappling with an overwhelming sense of loss and an acute awareness of their own fragility. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a landscape scarred by mass graves and haunted by silence. По мере того, как невидимая смерть распространялась по Европе, от Англии до Скандинавии, она несла с собой не просто болезнь, но и полный распад всего, что до этого казалось незыблемым. Когда чума достигала нового города или деревни, первым ощущением был шок, за которым быстро следовало всепоглощающее смятение. Люди видели, как здоровые еще утром соседи к вечеру уже лежали в лихорадке, а на следующий день их тела покрывались черными бубонами, набухшими, болезненными железами, которые кровоточили и гноились, являясь верным признаком приближающейся гибели. Воздух наполнялся стонами больных и криками отчаяния. Врачи, чьи знания основывались на древних теориях и травах, оказались абсолютно беспомощны. Они не понимали природу этой заразы. Ни кровопускания, ни припарки, ни молитвы не могли остановить ее. Болезнь была слишком быстрой, слишком жестокой. Часто сами целители становились ее первыми жертвами, заражаясь от пациентов, которых пытались спасти. Чувство безысходности росло с каждым часом. Церкви, прежде служившие оплотом надежды, теперь были заполнены умирающими или пусты, потому что священники либо погибали, либо бежали, бросая свою паству. Социальные структуры, выстраивавшиеся веками, рушились в одно мгновение. Семьи распадались. Родители бросали своих детей, дети покидали умирающих родителей, чтобы избежать заражения. Любовь, долг, родственные узы — все это отступало перед животным страхом смерти. Слуги бежали от своих господ, ремесленники закрывали лавки, купцы отказывались от торговли. Улицы, еще недавно шумные и полные жизни, теперь были жуткими и безмолвными, лишь изредка нарушаемые криками боли или звуком телег, собирающих мертвых. Проблема захоронения стала одной из самых острых. Тела накапливались быстрее, чем их можно было убрать. Кладбища переполнялись, и вскоре мертвых просто сбрасывали в огромные братские ямы, поспешно вырытые на окраинах городов. Земля не успевала принимать всех умерших, и зловоние разложения висело в воздухе, смешиваясь с запахом ладана, который тщетно пытались сжечь для очищения. Города, такие как Флоренция, описывались современниками как место, где ничто не делалось, кроме как хоронили мертвых. Управление городами фактически прекратилось. Суды не заседали, законы не соблюдались. Мародерство и хаос становились обыденностью, поскольку те, кто еще оставался в живых, часто теряли всякую мораль, видя, как смерть забирает всех без разбора. Некоторые предавались безудержным пирам, пытаясь заглушить страх в вине и разврате, веря, что каждый день может стать последним. Другие, наоборот, погружались в глубокое религиозное фанатизм, ища спасения в аскетизме и самобичевании. Психологическое воздействие чумы было не менее разрушительным, чем физическое. Страх перед неизвестным врагом, который мог поразить любого, вне зависимости от богатства или социального положения, порождал массовую паранойю. Люди становились подозрительными друг к другу, боясь каждого кашля, каждого чиха, каждого прикосновения. Чувство беспомощности и обреченности приводило к безумию, отчаянию и суициду. Вера в божественное провидение была подорвана, когда молитвы оставались без ответа, а смерть забирала праведников так же легко, как и грешников. В каждом городе, в каждой деревне чума оставляла за собой не просто горы трупов, но и зияющие пустоты в душах выживших. Те, кто оставался, были травмированы видом массовой гибели, потерей близких, утратой всех привычных ориентиров. Они жили в мире, который изменился до неузнаваемости, в мире, где смерть стала не исключением, а повседневной реальностью. Эта коллективная травма оставила глубокий след на сознании поколений, изменив отношение к жизни, к религии, к обществу и к самому смыслу существования. Европейское общество, каким оно было до 1348 года, перестало существовать, уступив место новой, более мрачной и непредсказуемой эпохе. Воздух был тяжелым, пропитанным запахом разложения и страха, а тишина, наступившая после криков, была еще более пугающей. Широкая тирада выминулся дедавых characters. The Black Death devastated Europe, causing not only immense loss of life with horrific symptoms, but also a complete breakdown of all social structures, medical knowledge, and governance. This led to widespread chaos, moral decay, and deep psychological trauma, fundamentally transforming European society forever. As the pestilence raged, consuming entire towns and leaving vast swathes of land desolate, the living grappled with an unbearable question. Why? Why had this unimaginable horror descended upon them? In an age dominated by faith and lacking any scientific understanding of disease transmission, the explanations offered were often rooted in divine will, astrological portents, or malevolent human action. You must understand that for medieval people, the world was a manifestation of God's plan, and such widespread suffering could only be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Many believed, with an intensity born of terror, that the plague was a direct punishment from God for the sins of humanity. This conviction ignited a fervent wave of religious devotion, often manifesting in extreme forms of penance. Across the continent, penitential processions became common sights. Groups of people, sometimes hundreds strong, would march from town to town, their faces grim, their voices raised in mournful hymns. These were the flagellants, a movement that gained alarming prominence during the Black Death. You would have seen them, men and sometimes women, stripped to the waist, publicly whipping themselves with scourges tipped with iron spikes. The air would have been thick with the sound of their self-inflicted blows, the rhythmic thud of leather on flesh, and the whispered prayers for mercy. They believed that through such extreme acts of self-mortification, they could atone for the collective sins of mankind and appease the wrath of a vengeful God, thereby halting the plague's advance. Their fanaticism, however, often led to attacks on those they deemed sinners or heretics, sometimes even clashing with established church authority, which eventually condemned their excesses. Beyond divine retribution, some educated minds, particularly physicians and scholars, sought answers in the celestial realm. They studied ancient texts and observed the heavens, concluding that the plague might be a consequence of astrological alignments. The great conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius in 1345 was frequently cited as a causative factor, believed to have created a poisonous miasma, a corrupted, invisible vapor, in the atmosphere. This miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air, was widely accepted and led to attempts to purify the air by burning aromatic herbs, incense, or even bonfires in the streets, filling the plague-stricken cities with the acrid smell of smoke and spices. You might have seen people carrying bouquets of flowers or herbs to hold to their noses, hoping to ward off the noxious fumes they believed carried death. But as the plague continued its relentless march, defying prayers, penance, and astrological predictions, the desperate search for an explanation twisted into a hunt for tangible, earthly culprits. When reason failed, fear and paranoia took hold, leading to a tragic and brutal wave of scapegoating. Minority groups, already marginalized and often viewed with suspicion, became convenient targets for a terrified populace seeking someone to blame for the inexplicable horrors unfolding around them. Tragically, the most vicious and widespread persecution was directed at the Jewish communities. Accusations, fueled by ancient prejudices and the desperate need for a concrete enemy, spread like wildfire. You would have heard the horrifying rumors. The Jews were poisoning wells, contaminating springs, and deliberately spreading the plague to exterminate Christians. These baseless claims were often amplified by the fact that Jewish communities, living in separate quarters and adhering to strict dietary and hygienic laws, such as ritual hand-washing, sometimes appeared to suffer fewer initial casualties, though this was not universally true and quickly ceased to be the case as the plague intensified. However, this perceived difference, combined with pre-existing anti-Semitism and the economic resentment over Jewish involvement in moneylending, ignited an inferno of violence. Across Europe, from Spain to Germany, Jewish ghettos became scenes of unimaginable horror. In Strasbourg, for example, in February 1349, over 2,000 Jewish people were dragged from their homes and burned alive on a specially constructed platform in the marketplace. despite the city's magistrate initially attempting to protect them. Similar atrocities occurred in Basel, Mainz, Cologne, and countless other towns, where entire communities were massacred or expelled, their property confiscated. The sheer brutality was staggering. You would have witnessed the smoke from the pyres, heard the screams, and seen the terror in the eyes of the innocent. Some authorities, like Pope Clement VI in Avignon, issued papal bulls condemning these persecutions and affirming the innocence of the Jewish people, reminding Christians that the plague affected all faiths. But these decrees were often ignored or arrived too late, powerless against the tide of mass hysteria and mob violence. Other scapegoats included beggars, lepers, and foreigners, anyone who stood apart or seemed different. But the Jewish communities bore the brunt of the most organized and widespread extermination. The search for meaning in the face of incomprehensible death led not to understanding, but to an appalling display of human cruelty, forever scarring the memory of the Black Death. Yet, as swiftly as the pestilence had swept across the continent, so too did its initial, most devastating wave begin to recede. It was not a sudden vanishing, but a slow, agonizing retreat, leaving behind a silence more profound than any noise. By the early 1350s, the first furious surge of the Black Death had largely passed, but it did not vanish entirely. Instead, it became an unwelcome, recurring visitor, returning in localized outbreaks for centuries, though none would match the sheer, overwhelming devastation of 1348 to 1351. The initial wave had run its course, having consumed its fuel of human vulnerability and interconnectedness. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of desolation. You would have witnessed fields lying fallow, villages emptied, their stone hearths grown cold, and cities that once teemed with life now eerily quiet, the echoes of former bustle replaced by a heavy stillness. The sheer scale of death defies easy comprehension. Estimates suggest that between 30 to 50% of Europe's total population perished in just a few short years. This meant that in some regions, half or even two-thirds of the people were gone, leaving behind vast empty lands and profound collective trauma. Imagine the chilling absence of familiar faces, the profound silence of empty homes, the sudden void in every aspect of daily life. This catastrophic loss of life fundamentally reshaped the continent, setting in motion a series of cascading effects. The most immediate and tangible impact was on the economy. With so many people gone, labor became incredibly scarce across all sectors, from agriculture to crafts. Peasants and artisans who survived found themselves in a dramatically altered landscape. Their skills and physical presence were now invaluable, a commodity far more precious than land. For centuries, the feudal system had rigidly tethered serfs to the land, binding them to their lords. But now, with landowners desperate for workers, these survivors could demand higher wages, negotiate better working conditions, and even achieve personal freedom from traditional obligations. Many left ancestral lands, seeking opportunities in towns or on estates where labor was most needed. This shift slowly but surely eroded the foundations of feudalism, empowering the common worker in ways previously unimaginable, leading to a gradual redistribution of wealth. Land, once the primary source of wealth and power, became abundant and cheaper, while the value of human labor soared, flipping an ancient economic paradigm on its head and initiating a new era of economic relations. Beyond economics, society itself underwent a profound transformation. The authority of traditional institutions, particularly the church, was deeply shaken. Many people questioned why a benevolent God would permit such widespread suffering, or why the clergy, despite their fervent prayers and solemn rituals, seemed as powerless as anyone else against the relentless plague. This widespread skepticism, born from raw grief and deep disillusionment, subtly paved the way for future religious reforms and a more individualistic approach to faith, challenging the monolithic power of the medieval church. Social hierarchies, once rigid, began to loosen. With the deaths of many noble families and skilled craftsmen, opportunities arose for those from lower social strata to ascend, to fill the vast demographic gaps. A peasant's son might inherit land, or an apprentice might quickly rise to master status in a guild, simply because there were so few others left. This increased social mobility, though born from tragedy, contributed to the emergence of a more dynamic and less rigid social structure in the centuries that followed, laying groundwork for a burgeoning middle class. The psychological impact was equally profound. A generation grew up having witnessed unimaginable death and suffering, a constant shadow. This pervasive experience permeated art, literature, and the daily outlook. Themes of mortality, the fleeting nature of life, and the undeniable equality of death, famously depicted in the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, where skeletons lead people of all social classes to their graves, became common motifs, a stark reminder of humanity's fragility. Some responded with fatalistic despair. Others embraced a renewed focus on piety and spiritual salvation. Still others embraced a hedonistic, live-for-today philosophy, seeking pleasure in the face of inevitable doom. Cities, though initially devastated, often recovered more quickly than rural areas due to their inherent advantages. The surviving populations were often more resilient, and the concentration of wealth and services in urban centers eventually drew people from the countryside. The immense crisis also, paradoxically, spurred innovation. New public health measures, though rudimentary, began to be implemented, such as quarantines and sanitation improvements.